I once told my father, in a room full of people who weren't family, that his ideas were outdated, and the worst part isn't what I said. It's that he agreed with me. I told him in the small conference room, not the big one, because I didn't want the whole floor watching. That was the one courtesy I gave him. I said, "Dad, the process you built runs on assumptions from 1994. The market doesn't care how well it used to work." He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a habit of 40 years, and he took them all the way off before he answered. He said, "If that's what the numbers say." 4 words. He didn't ask which numbers. He didn't ask who ran them. He picked up his coffee, and it had gone cold an hour ago, and he drank it anyway like that was the point. I told myself that was relief. I told myself a man who built something from nothing knows when to let it go. I was wrong about what I was watching, and I wouldn't understand how wrong for another 18 months, until a woman named Diane Ferris called my office at 8:40 in the morning and asked if I had a few minutes to discuss the Callaway Fabrication Shareholder Agreement of March 1987. My name is Marcus Callaway. I'm 41. I live in Cincinnati, in the same house I grew up visiting on weekends, 3 miles from the plant my father built with a $14,000 equipment loan and a handshake from a steel supplier who'd known him since they were both 22. I'm the vice president of operations at Callaway Fabrication, which is my father's company, which I have spent the last 6 years quietly turning into mine. I have a wife, Carol, 2 kids, an engineering degree, and a way of talking about myself when I'm not careful that makes all of that sound like something I built alone. I didn't. None of it. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because if I tell it any other way I'll start protecting myself in the telling, and I don't want to do that anymore. I did that enough while it was happening. I'm not going to narrate this as a confession dressed up as an apology, and I'm not going to narrate it as a man performing regret for an audience. I'm going to tell you what I did, why I believed it was reasonable, and what it turned out I didn't know. That's the order. I'll try not to skip ahead to the part where I feel bad about it, because I think skipping ahead is its own kind of dishonesty. It lets you collect the sympathy before you've earned the accounting. My father is Walter Callaway. He's 74 now. In 1979, he was a machinist with a good eye and a bad temper for waste. And he took that $14,000 loan and a single Bridgeport mill and started making custom brackets for a regional auto parts supplier out of a rented bay behind a tire shop on Spring Grove Avenue. By 1991, he had 11 employees and a building of his own. By 2004, he had 92 employees, a second building, and a reputation in the precision fabrication world that meant when Honda's Marysville plant had a tolerance problem nobody else could solve, they called Walter Callaway before they called their own engineers. He built the company on one rule, which he said out loud so often that it became a kind of company scripture: measure twice, sign once. He meant it about tolerances. He also meant it, I understand now, about everything else. Every agreement, every partnership, every piece of paper with his name on it. My father did not sign things he hadn't read twice. That detail didn't seem important to me for 39 years. It became the entire story. I came up through the business the way sons of founders do, when the founder is careful, slowly, and with conditions. I ran the loading dock summers in high school. I did 2 years on the floor as a machinist's apprentice before he'd let me touch a purchase order. I got an engineering degree from Ohio State because he told me a Callaway who couldn't read a tolerance chart had no business managing people who could. And he was right, and I resented being right about it for years. By the time I was 35, I was running operations, and by 38, I was running most of the company in practice, because my father had slowed down the way founders do. Not because he'd lost anything, but because he'd started trusting me with the wheel and keeping his hands loose on it. I told myself that trust was the same thing as decline. That's the piece I have to be honest about. I mistook a father's restraint for a father's fading, and I built 2 years of decisions on top of that mistake before anyone called me on it. There's a habit my father has that everyone who's worked for him for more than a year learns to recognize, and I want to put it on the record now because it becomes the whole hinge of this story later. When he's handed a contract, a quote, a purchase order, anything with his name required at the bottom, he reads it twice, all the way through, in silence, before he picks up a pen. Not skims. Reads. The first pass, his lips barely move, like he's checking the words against something. The second pass, he goes slower, and if you're standing there waiting on him, you learn not to rush it, because rushing it only makes him start over from the top. Measure twice, sign once, he'd say, and for years I heard that as a saying about steel, about a fabrication shop, where a 1/16 of an inch off spec means a rejected part and a furious customer. I did not understand, until I was 40 years old, that my father had never once in his life meant it only about steel. He meant it about every signature he ever put on a page, including the ones from decades before I was old enough to be in the room when he signed them. The pressure that led me to what I did next was real, and I want to be fair to that version of myself instead of flattening him into a villain for the sake of a cleaner story. Callaway Fab had lost the Marysville contract renewal in late 2023, 11% of revenue, gone in one email from a procurement director I'd had lunch with, twice, because a newer, faster shop out of Louisville had underbid us using a manufacturing execution system that could retool a line in 90 minutes instead of our 6 hours. That number, 6 hours versus 90 minutes, sat in my head for months like a stone I couldn't put down. My father's response to that loss, in the one meeting where I raised it directly with him, was to convene the shop foreman and talk for 40 minutes about craftsmanship, about the Callaway name meaning something a spreadsheet couldn't capture. I remember sitting in the back of that meeting doing math in my head instead of listening, because I already knew what the math said, and I didn't think craftsmanship was going to pay down the equipment loan we'd need for the software that would actually fix it. My response, where his was craftsmanship, was to start pricing out the software the same week. I had a wife, 2 kids in a private school my father had insisted on paying half the tuition for without ever being asked, and a board, 3 outside investors we'd brought in during a 2016 expansion, who were starting to ask pointed questions about succession, about whether the company's methods could scale past its founder. I told myself someone had to make the hard call, and that if I didn't make it, the company my father built would be a smaller version of itself in 5 years instead of the modern one it could become in 2. That reasoning felt sound to me at the time. It still sounds mostly sound to me now. What I got wrong wasn't the diagnosis. It was how I delivered it, and who I decided didn't need to be consulted anymore. The act itself happened over about 6 weeks in the spring of last year, and it built to one specific afternoon I can still walk through minute by minute. I'd hired an operations consultant, a woman named Priya Nair, to run an efficiency audit, and her report, 41 pages, spiral-bound, sitting on my desk right now as I record this, used the word legacy 9 times to describe my father's shop floor methods. Legacy inspection protocol, legacy batch scheduling, legacy vendor relationships that hadn't been rebid in over a decade. I remember reading it on a Sunday night at my kitchen table and feeling something close to relief, because it gave me a document instead of a feeling. And a document is easier to stand behind in a room full of investors than a feeling is. I presented the findings to the full board in the big conference room, the one with the window facing the loading dock, on a Thursday in April. My father was there because he was still chairman, a title everyone including me had started treating as ceremonial. I stood at the head of the table where he used to stand and told the board that Callaway Fabrication needed to modernize its production floor, that the man who designed our quality control process 20 years ago hadn't updated it since, and that continuing to defer to a system built for a different market, different customers, and different margins was, in my words, sentimental, not strategic. I remember one of the outside investors, a man named Kurt Belding, glancing at my father when I said it. The way people glance at someone to see if they should be embarrassed on his behalf. I looked at my father when I said it. He was sitting at the far end, hands folded on the table, and he didn't look away, and he didn't look wounded. He nodded, slowly, the way he used to nod at a bad weld before telling someone to redo it. My sister Renee, who sits on the board as the family's second voting member, went very still, and then said, "Quietly, Dad. Do you want to respond to that?" I remember being irritated with her for making a moment out of it, for turning a business presentation into a referendum on somebody's feelings. My father just said, "Marcus has been closer to the floor than I have this year. If that's what the numbers say, we should look at it." 4 words again. Almost the same 4 words he'd give me a week later in the small conference room. He picked up the water glass in front of him, took a sip, and set it back down exactly where it had been, like he was returning a tool to its place on a pegboard. Nobody else at that table noticed that detail. I noticed it and thought nothing of it because I had already decided what his stillness meant before he opened his mouth. The board took his agreement as the final word because that's what it was designed to sound like. I took it as vindication. Kurt Belding actually reached over and shook my father's hand afterward and told him it took a big man to hear that kind of thing gracefully, and my father said, "It does," and left it there, and I remember thinking, at the time, that the flatness in his voice was fatigue. Renee, when we were alone in the parking lot afterward, told me I'd just publicly told our father he was obsolete in front of 3 people who weren't family, and that agreeing with me in that room had probably cost him more than disagreeing would have. She said it quietly, the way she says things she's already decided aren't going to change my mind, which made it worse somehow, that she wasn't even trying to argue with me. I told her she was being sentimental too. I want to be honest that I said that. I want to be honest that I believed it. 2 weeks later, I moved him out of the corner office, the one with the window and the parts wall where he kept 40 years of prototype brackets lined up like a timeline of the company, and into a smaller office down the hall, one we'd been using for storage. Because I told him, and told myself, that the corner office made more sense as a client meeting room now that we were pursuing the aerospace tier contracts the new software let us bid on. I remember telling him about the move on a Tuesday and having him say only, "Makes sense, if that's where the clients need to sit," and I remember feeling, in that moment, a small flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt but was close enough to it that I talked myself out of examining it. He helped move his own boxes. I offered to send 2 guys from the floor to do it, and he said no, he'd rather do it himself, and I took that as pride. The harmless kind. An old man not wanting help with light lifting. He asked only one question the whole afternoon, standing in the doorway of the smaller office with a box of those prototype brackets in his arms. The cardboard sagging a little at the bottom seam, "You'll keep the parts wall somewhere people can still see it?" I told him sure, eventually, once we figured out the new layout. I never did. The brackets are still in a box in a storage unit off Reading Road, 6 miles from the office, and I paid the storage fee automatically out of a company card for a year and a half without once driving out to look inside. That's the specific, ordinary cruelty in this story, the one I think about more than any of the bigger ones. Not a confrontation. Just a box that never got unpacked because I never made the time, and a man who asked once, plainly, and didn't ask twice when I didn't follow through. Renee found out about the office move before I told her. From Donna, my father's assistant, and she called me that night. She didn't yell. She asked me one question. "Did you ask him, or did you tell him?" I told her the distinction didn't matter, that it was a business decision about office space, not a referendum on his feelings. She was quiet for a second and then said, "With Dad, Marcus, there's no such thing as a decision that isn't also about his feelings. He just doesn't let you see the seam." I didn't understand what she meant by that until much later. At the time I told her she was reading too much into a floor plan. For the next 18 months, life proceeded exactly the way I'd told the board it would. The Mez software cut our retooling time from 6 hours to 90 minutes, same as Louisville. We won back a piece of the Marysville business by Q1 of this year. Revenue was up 14%. My wife Carol and I closed on a lake house we'd been eyeing for 3 years, and I remember standing on the dock the day we got the keys thinking that this was what all of it, the audit, the boardroom, the reorganized floor plan, had been for. My father came to Sunday dinner every week, asked about his grandkids' school projects with real attention. the kind where he remembered the name of my daughter's science fair partner 3 weeks running, and brought Carol tomatoes from the garden he'd started keeping more seriously since he had, in his words, more time on his hands now. I told myself that sentence meant contentment. I told myself a lot of sentences meant contentment that year, because it was easier than asking what they actually meant. He never once, in 18 months, raised the boardroom, the office, or the audit. Not obliquely, not in a joke that had teeth in it, not in the tightened voice people use when they're deciding not to bring something up. If anything, he seemed lighter that year than I'd seen him in a decade, quicker to laugh at dinner, more willing to hand my son a screwdriver and let him take apart a small engine on the garage floor, less inclined to correct me in front of other people the way he used to when he still ran the shop day to day. I read all of that as a man settling into retirement gracefully. Renee, on the 2 occasions she brought it up that year, read it differently, though she didn't say so outright until much later. She told me once, almost as an aside, "He seems busy for a man with nothing to do." And I laughed and said, "Gardening keeps you busier than people think." There were 3 things in that 18 months that I noticed and filed away as nothing, and I want to lay them out honestly because at the time none of them alarmed me even slightly. I want to be clear that nothing about how he mentioned any of them was strange in the moment. That's the whole point of how carefully he did it. If any one of them had seemed strange, I'd have looked closer, and he knew that better than I did. The first was a document. About 4 months after the board meeting, my father mentioned, almost in passing while we were grilling in his backyard, tongs in one hand, that he'd pulled the original 1987 partnership restructuring papers out of the safe deposit box to make sure the archive at the office had a complete copy. You never know what a bank does with old boxes. I said that sounded like a good idea, thinking mostly about the burgers, and asked nothing else about it. I didn't know then that those 1987 papers were the ones that mattered more than any contract we'd signed since. And I didn't know that he'd already read them twice, cover to cover, before he ever mentioned them to me. The second was a meeting. In the fall, his assistant, he still had a part-time assistant, Donna, who'd worked for him since 1998 and outlasted 3 of my own hires in the same span, mentioned to my office manager, in the kind of small talk that happens near the coffee machine, that Mr. Calloway had gone downtown for an appointment with Frank and would be back after lunch. I asked, lightly, who Frank was, more out of habit than real curiosity. Donna said, "Frank Delacroix, from way back, did the company's legal work before you were old enough to remember it, I think." Nice man. They get lunch a couple times a year. I filed that under nostalgia. An old man visiting an old friend, the kind of thing men my father's age do more of as the calendar opens up. I never asked what they talked about over that lunch, because it did not occur to me that there was anything to ask about. The third was smaller still, and it's the one that, looking back, should have told me the most, because it was the only one where he asked me a direct question instead of just mentioning something in passing. In January, at Sunday dinner, with the kids already excused from the table, my father asked me, apropos of nothing in the conversation before it, exactly what the aerospace contracts required in terms of licensing for the alloy forming process, the one he'd developed himself in the early 2000s, working nights in the shop after everyone else had gone home. The one that was still, on paper, the entire reason Callaway Fab could bid on aerospace tier tolerances at all. I told him the process was fully integrated into company operations and he didn't need to worry about the paperwork side of it anymore, that legal had it handled, that it was one less thing for him to think about. He set his fork down, I remember that specifically, because he's not a man who fidgets with silverware, and said, "I'd just like to see the current licensing agreement sometime, when you have a copy handy. Not urgent." I told him I'd get it to him. I didn't. I forgot, the way you forget a promise to someone you've stopped thinking of as someone whose questions carry weight. And I want to say plainly that the forgetting wasn't malicious. It was worse than malicious. It was simple carelessness toward a man I'd already, quietly, stopped taking seriously enough to follow through on. The turn came on a Tuesday morning in June, 18 months and 11 days after the board meeting, while I was in the middle of closing the single largest deal of my career, a $22 million acquisition offer from a Dayton-based industrial group called Ferris Meridian, who wanted to buy Callaway Fabrication outright, fold it into their portfolio, and keep me on as division president. I had verbal agreement from their board. I had a signing scheduled for that Friday. I had already, if I'm honest, started picturing the announcement, the trade press write-up, the framed tombstone deal plaque I planned to hang in the lobby, right about where the parts wall used to be, back when there was a parts wall anyone could see. My phone rang at 8:40, and the voice on the other end said, "Mr. Callaway, my name is Diane Ferris. I'm an attorney, and I represent your father in a matter concerning the Callaway Fabrication shareholder agreement dated March the 14th, 1987. Do you have a few minutes?" I remember laughing, briefly, an actual short laugh, because the sentence didn't parse. My father didn't have an attorney. My father had Frank Delacroix, who I'd filed away as an old lunch companion, and our corporate counsel, who worked for the company, not for him personally. I said, "I think there's some confusion. My father isn't involved in any active legal matters that I'm aware of." Diane Ferris said, evenly, "That's part of what I'm calling to clear up, Mr. Callaway. I don't think this needs to be adversarial, but I do need about 40 minutes of your time today, and I'd strongly recommend your counsel be on the call." I did not, at first, have a few minutes, because I did not understand what she could possibly be calling about. I asked her to explain. What she explained, over the next 40 minutes, and then in a follow-up meeting 2 days later in her office on 4th Street, a corner conference room with a view of the river, a legal pad in front of her already tabbed at 3 separate pages before I'd even sat down, was this: when my father restructured the company's ownership in 1987 to bring on 2 minority investors and formalize succession planning for the first time, he had, at his own attorney's suggestion, Frank Delacroix's suggestion, the same Frank he'd visited that fall over lunch I'd never once asked about, retained a class of shares carrying what the document called a founder's reserved consent right. In plain terms, any sale, merger, or licensing transfer of the company's core intellectual property required his written consent, regardless of what percentage of common stock he held or had transferred to me over the years. That right had never been amended, revoked, or bought out in any of the subsequent restructurings, including the 2016 investor round that brought in Kurt Belding and the other 2 outside directors. Nobody currently at the company, not me, not our corporate counsel, not the board, not the associate who'd done diligence on our own cap table 3 separate times over the years, had read that clause closely enough to understand it still applied. Because for 37 years it had never needed to. Diane Ferris slid a photocopy of the original page across the table to me. I remember the paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, the typeface clearly from a different decade of law office equipment, and there, in a paragraph I had genuinely never seen before, despite it living in our own corporate archive the whole time, was language granting Walter J. Callaway a standing consent right over any transfer of core intellectual property assets, whether held by the corporation or by the founder individually. My father had never used it. He had simply never given it up. There was a second piece, and this one was the harder floor to hit. The alloy forming process. The actual intellectual property Ferris Meridian wanted most. The reason our aerospace bid was competitive at all was patented not to Callaway Fabrication, the corporation, but to Walter Callaway, the individual, filed under his own name in 2004 with an attorney's help he'd apparently never mentioned to anyone but Frank Delacroix and, now, Diane Ferris. The company operated under a standing license, renewed automatically each year in a form nobody in our legal department had bothered to actually reread since it was first executed. That Diane Ferris's letter now formally put on notice, under the terms Frank Delacroix had drafted back in 2004, that license required the licensor's written consent before it could be assigned to any successor entity. In an acquisition, my father hadn't revoked the license. He hadn't threatened to. He had simply exercised, for the first time in his life, his right to be formally consulted on the terms under which it might change hands. I asked Diane Ferris, more sharply than I meant to, whether my father was trying to blow up the deal. She didn't flinch. She said, "Your father isn't trying to stop this sale, Mr. Calloway. He's trying to make sure it happens on terms that don't leave the plant floor holding the cost of it. He asked me to tell you that directly, so you wouldn't spend the week assuming the worst about his intentions." Then she slid a second document across. Not a demand letter, but a short, plainly worded list, 4 lines, of the conditions under which he'd provide written consent. I read it twice myself, the way he would have, before I said anything. There was nothing in it about money. There was nothing in it about me. I sat in my car in the parking garage on 4th Street for 11 minutes before I could drive home. Not because the deal was in danger, though it was, for about 9 days, until we restructured the terms. I sat there because I understood, all at once, what 18 months of small, ordinary, forgettable details had actually been. My father hadn't pulled those 1987 papers to check an archive. He'd pulled them because he already knew, the day I told a boardroom his methods were sentimental, that a day might come when I'd try to sell what he'd built without him in the room, and he wanted the paper to say what it said before that day arrived. He hadn't gone to see an old friend for nostalgia. He'd gone to confirm, with the man who drafted it, that the founders' reserved consent right still held, and to have Frank Delacroix's daughter, who I'd learned later had taken over Frank's practice and referred my father to Diane Ferris, quietly review whether 37 years of subsequent paperwork had touched it. He hadn't asked about the licensing agreement out of idle curiosity at a Sunday dinner. He'd been checking, calmly, without a trace of accusation in his voice, whether I'd noticed what he still controlled. I hadn't. Not once. I ran the tape back further, sitting in that garage, and things realigned that I hadn't thought to question at the time. The evening he mentioned the safe deposit box, over the grill he'd asked me, almost as an afterthought, how the aerospace bid numbers were tracking, and I'd told him, in detail, proud of the margins, not realizing I was handing a man building a legal case exactly the operational context he needed to know how much leverage he was sitting on. The lunch with Frank had happened 2 weeks after I told him not to worry about the licensing paperwork anymore. The dinner question about the licensing agreement had come the same month Ferris Meridian's name first appeared in an email chain he wasn't copied on, but that Donna, I'd learned, still had partial visibility into through the shared office calendar. None of it was surveillance. It was attention. The specific, unhurried attention of a man who had never once stopped reading the instruments on his own machine, even after he'd let someone else's hands rest on the controls. I had spent a year and a half operating a company under the confident assumption that my father's silence meant surrender, when the whole time it had been the quiet. Exact maintenance of a man who measures twice and signs once, applied not to a weld this time, but to his own son. Ferris Meridian's counsel found the consent clause within 48 hours of Diane Ferris's letter arriving on their desk, which meant I couldn't have kept it from the board even if some worse version of myself had wanted to try. And I want to be honest that for about 6 of those first hours, before I fully understood what my father was actually asking for, some worse version of myself did want to try. I sat with that impulse long enough to be ashamed of it, and then called our corporate counsel instead. The deal didn't collapse. That's the part I want to be exact about, because it would be easy to tell this story as a story about a father who blew up his son's biggest win to teach him a lesson, and that isn't what happened, and I won't let it be told that way. My father's one substantive demand, delivered through Diane Ferris in writing, was that any sale include a 5-year no-layoff guarantee for existing plant staff, a continuation of the current pension match, and a written commitment that the Calloway name and the original Spring Grove Avenue plant would remain the division's operating identity for at least a decade. He asked for nothing for himself. No board seat, no consulting fee, no ownership retention, no public statement, no apology. Diane Ferris told me, in that same meeting, "I've done this kind of work for 22 years. Mr. Calloway, most fathers in your father's position ask for something for themselves first." He didn't ask me to draft a single clause about himself. I asked him if he was sure, and he said the company owed the men on the floor more than it owed him, and that debt was older. Ferris Meridian, to their credit, agreed to all 3 terms within a week. The deal was too good for them to walk from over conditions that cost them almost nothing, and we signed on a Friday 12 days later than originally planned, at $22. $4,400,000 higher than the original number, because Ferris had also renegotiated the earnout structure while she had their attention. A fact she mentioned to me almost as an aside, the way you'd mention you'd also picked up milk while you were out. I asked to see him the following Monday. At the house, not the office. Because I wanted whatever this conversation was to happen somewhere that wasn't built around either of our titles. He was in the backyard, near the tomatoes, a pair of pruning shears in one hand, and he didn't stop working when I came out, which I understood, correctly this time, as him giving me room to say what I'd come to say without an audience even of one. I told him I knew now what he'd done and why, and I asked him, because I genuinely didn't understand it, why he hadn't just told me, 18 months ago, that he still held that right. Why he'd let me stand in that boardroom and say what I said when 4 words could have stopped me before I ever got there. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. He set the shears down on the low wall beside the tomato bed, wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "You needed to believe you could do it without me for a while. I needed the paper to say what it said in case you were wrong about that. Those weren't the same thing, so I did both." That was the whole of it. No accounting of the slights, no mention of the small office or the boxed-up brackets. No accounting of what it cost him to sit in that boardroom and agree with a son who just called him sentimental in front of strangers with money. I asked if he'd been angry that day in the small conference room when I told him his ideas were outdated. He looked at me for a second like the question surprised him and said, "I've been angrier at worse welds." And then, because I must have looked like I needed more than that, he added, "You weren't wrong that the shop needed to change. You were wrong about what I had left. Those are 2 different mistakes, and only one of them was yours to make." I understood then that he'd sorted this out in his own mind a long time before I had. That he'd separated my legitimate business judgment from my failure to extend him the respect of being consulted, and that he'd decided deliberately to let the first stand and only quietly correct the second. That is not a man who was diminished. That is a man who ran a cost-benefit analysis on his own son's disrespect and decided which parts of it to let go and which parts required paper, and did the sorting so cleanly that I never even saw him do it. I want to be precise about the 2 things I had to sit with, because they arrived separately and in a particular order, and collapsing them into one realization would flatten what actually happened. The first was simply factual. I had misjudged my father's capability. Not his memory, not his competence in the shop. I'd never doubted those. I had misjudged how much of the actual architecture of the company he still held in his hands, 37 years after he built it, because I'd let his quiet in that boardroom stand in for his position, and those are not the same measurement. A man can lower his voice without losing his grip. I hadn't checked which one my father had done. That's a factual error, and I can say it plainly without performing shame over it, because performing shame is its own kind of dodge. It lets you feel bad instead of doing the harder work of getting it right going forward. The second realization took longer, and it's the one that actually changed something in me. It wasn't that he'd outmaneuvered me. It's that he had the standing to expose me, to the board, to Renee, to Carol, to Ferris Meridian, to the trade press that covers Cincinnati manufacturing closely enough that this story would have made him look like the wronged founder and me look like exactly what I was, and he chose not to use any of it that way. He could have let Ferris Meridian's lawyers discover the clause and used it to extract a personal payout, or a public apology, or my resignation. He asked for pension protection and a 5-year guarantee for men who'd worked the floor for him for 20 years. That isn't the choice of a man protecting his pride. That's the choice of a man who'd already decided, a long time before I understood any of this, that whatever I owed him personally was a separate account from what the company owed the people who built it alongside him, and that he wasn't going to let one debt get paid out of the other. His restraint wasn't passivity. It was the same discipline he'd applied to every weld and every contract for 45 years, aimed, this time, at his own hurt. so that it wouldn't spill onto people who hadn't earned any part of it. The direct scene between us, the real one, not the backyard conversation, which was more explanation than acknowledgement, happened about 3 weeks later, in the storage unit off Reading Road, where I'd driven on a Saturday morning without telling anyone, including myself, exactly why. I found the box of prototype brackets he'd carried out of the corner office with his own hands, still taped shut. I called him and asked if he'd come help me figure out where to put them. He drove over in 20 minutes. We didn't say much while we unloaded the box into my car. I'd decided, on the drive there, that I was rebuilding the parts wall, not in his old office, but in the front lobby, where clients would see it first, where the story of the company would be the first thing anyone walking into Callaway Fabrication learned. When we had the last bracket out, he held one up, the first one, from 1979, the bracket that got him the tire shop bay, turned it over once, and said, "Took you longer to hang these back up than it took me to build the company." I said that was probably fair. He said, "It's fair," not softening it, and then he put the bracket back in the box himself, careful, the way he handles everything, and said, "Good, let's get it up before Monday." That was the whole reckoning, in his language. No tears, no absolution offered in a single sentence. Just an old man correcting the record and moving on to the next task, the way he always has. The repair, in the weeks after, was specific rather than symbolic, because I understood by then that a symbolic gesture from me would be exactly the kind of easy, self-serving comfort I'd been giving myself for 18 months, and he deserved better than easy. I did 3 concrete things. First, the parts wall went up in the lobby, 45 years of prototypes. With a small brass plaque Renee helped me word, every tolerance on this wall was measured twice by the same hand. Second, in the final Ferris Meridian agreement, I insisted, against some resistance from their counsel, that the alloy forming process retain a permanent named attribution clause, any technical documentation, patent filing, or public materials referencing the process must credit it as the Callaway method, developed by Walter Callaway. It cost us nothing in the negotiation, and it meant his name would outlast the sale. Outlast me, in a way a title on an org chart never would have. Third, I asked him to come back 1 day a week, not as chairman, not ceremonially, but specifically to run quality control review on the aerospace line, the actual job his eye was still better at than anyone else's, mine included, and I told him that plainly instead of dressing it up as a favor to him. He thought about it for 3 days before he said yes, which is exactly how long he thinks about everything that matters, and when he said yes, he said, "Thursdays. I've got the tomatoes on the other days." I didn't push for more than Thursdays. I understood by then that asking for more would have been about my need to feel forgiven faster than his terms allowed, and his terms were the ones that mattered here, not mine. He hasn't said the word forgiveness, and I don't expect he will, and I've stopped waiting for it, because I understand now that what he's given me instead, Thursdays, the plaque, the willingness to drive to a storage unit on a Saturday without asking why, is worth more than a sentence would be. Dignity, on both sides, intact. That was always going to be the only version of this that fit who he is, and I'm grateful I finally stopped needing a bigger scene than the one he was willing to give me. Renee asked me, a few weeks after the first Thursday, whether I thought he'd really let it go, or whether he was just too disciplined to show me if he hadn't. I told her I didn't think those were as different as she meant them to be, that for a man like my father, the discipline isn't a mask over the feeling. It is the feeling, worked all the way through until only the useful part of it is left standing. She thought about that longer than I expected her to, and then she said, "That's probably the most honest thing you've said about him in 2 years." I didn't argue with her. I don't think I have the standing to anymore, and I've stopped minding that I don't. What I keep coming back to, turning this over the way he'd turn over a weld to check the back of it, is how easy it is to mistake a person's quiet for the outer edge of what they have left, when it might just as easily be the edge of what they've decided to spend on you. I told my father his ideas were outdated, and I believed I was being efficient about it. Not cruel. He agreed with me, and I believed that was the end of the argument, when it was actually the beginning of a much longer one he intended to have entirely on paper, on his own schedule, at a cost to me that he calibrated exactly to fit the offense and not $1 past it. I think the real mistake isn't underestimating what an old man has left. It's assuming that a person's silence is a report on their strength, instead of a decision about how they're choosing to use it. My father never stopped being capable. He just stopped needing me to notice, until noticing was the only way I had left to make it right. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.